2 days short of the winter solstice, the turn of the year's tide. All that cold day, the city and the countryside around felt halted, paused, 5 degrees below freezing and the earth battened down. Clouds held snow that would not fall, and out in the suburbs the schools were closed, people homeward bound, the pavements rinky and the roads black-iced. The sun ran a shallow arc across the sky, then just before dusk the snow came, dropping straight for 5 hours and settling at a steady inch an hour. I was at my desk that evening, trying to work, but distracted by the weather. I kept stopping, standing, looking out of the window. The snow was sinking through the orange cone cast by a streetlight, the fat flakes showing like furnace sparks. Around 8 o'clock, the snow ceased. An hour later, I went for a walk with a flask of whiskey to keep me warm. I walked for half a mile along dark back roads where the snow lay clean and unmarked. The houses began to thin out, a few undrawn curtains, family evenings underway. The flicker and burble of television sets, the cold like a wire in the nose. A slew of stars, the moon flooding everything with silver. At the southerly fringe of the suburb, a last lamppost stands by a hawthorn hedge, and next to it is a hole in the hedge which leads down to a modest field path. I followed the field path east-southeast towards a long chalk hilltop, visible as a whaleback in the darkness. Northwards was the glow of the city and the red blip of aircraft warning lights from towers and cranes. Dry snow squeaked underfoot. A fox crossed the field to my west at a trot. The moonlight was so bright that everything cast a crisp moon shadow, black on white, stark as woodcut. Wands of dogwood made zebra hide of the path. Hawthorn through a lattice. The trees were frilled with snow, which lay to the depth of an inch or more on branches and twigs. The snow caused everything to exceed itself, and the moonlight caused everything to double itself. This is the path I've probably walked more than any other in my life. It's a young way, maybe 50 years old, no more. Its easterly hedge is mostly hawthorn and around 8 feet high. Its westerly hedge is a younger mix of blackthorn, hawthorn, hazel and dogwood. It's not normally a beautiful place, but there's a feeling of secrecy to it that I appreciate, hedged in as it is on both sides and running discreetly as it does between field and road. In summer, I've seen rolling clouds of goldfinches rising from teasel heads and then curling ahead to settle again, retreating in the measure that I approached them. That evening the path was grey snow alley, and I followed it up to the hanger of beech trees that tops the Whaleback Hill, passing off the clay and into the chalk proper. At the back brink of the beechwood, I ducked through an ivy-trailed gap and was into the 40-acre field that lies beyond. At first sight, the field seems flawless, flow country. Then I set out across it and started to see the signs. The snow was densely printed with tracks of birds and animals, archives of the hundreds of journeys made since the snow had stopped. There were neat deer slots, partridge prints like arrowheads pointing the way, and the pads of rabbits. Lines of tracks curved away from me across the field, disappearing into shadow or hedge. The moonlight, falling at a slant, deepened the dark in the nearer tracks, so that they appeared full as inkwells. To all these marks I added my own. The snow was overwhelmingly legible. Each print trail seemed like a plot that could be read backwards in time, a series of allusions to events since ended. I found a line of foxpugs, which here and there had been swept across by the fox's brush, as if it had been trying to erase evidence of its own passage. I discovered what I supposed were the traces of a pheasant taking off, trench footprints where it had pushed up, then spaced feather presses either side of the tracks, becoming progressively lighter and then vanishing altogether. I chose to follow a deer's trail which angled tightly across a corner of the field. The slots led through a blackthorn hedge. I snagged my way after them and emerged into a surreal landscape. To my north, the land swooped smoothly away downhill for 300 yards or so. South and uphill of where I stood, big white humps surrounded what appeared to be a small, neat lake with a flagstick in its centre. There were copses of beech and stands of pine, sudden drops and draws in the land, rounded hills and swathed valleys. I walked over to the lake, stepped out onto its surface, and by its flagstick I sat down and took a drink of whiskey. Edited of its golfers by the darkness, transformed by snowfall and moonlight, the country's most exclusive golf course had become a strange realm of open country. Murmuring insincere apologies to the club's members, I left the first green and set off to explore the course. I walked straight down the middle of the fairway after fairway, my shadow falling undistorted by my side. In the bunkers, snow lay calf-deep and sifted. On the fifth green, I lay on my back and watched the stars slow wheel. Most of the animal tracks on the course had been left by rabbits. If you've seen rabbits' prints in snow, you will know they resemble a Halloween ghost mask or the face of Edvard Munch's Screamer. The two rear feet are placed laterally to make elongated eyes, and between and behind them fall the forefeet of a slightly offset paired line, forming nose and oval mouth. Thousands of these faces peered at me from the snow. Occasionally the headlights of cars on the road to the west showed us long yellow tunnels of light. On the 12th fairway, something large and dark ran from tree to scrub cover. It looked like a wolf, but must have been a deer or fox, and set needles of silly fear pricking in the backs of my hands. At the far end of the course, I followed rabbit tracks through another blackthorn hedge and onto the Roman road that runs for miles over low chalk hills. The road looked magnificent in the snow, the white line of its route leading the eye far in either direction, and I walked it southeast. Vast fields were visible through hedges to either side, throwing moonlight back up in hard, pale sheets. A bird moving in a tall ash tree sent snow dropping across the path ahead of me, falling like speckles on early film. Distance stretched oddly, or perhaps time compressed, for it seemed that I had been moving for many miles or hours before I reached the point where the Roman road passed the end of a wide avenue of beeches that I recognised. I walked up the avenue, skirted the earthworks of a large Iron Age ring fort, crossed a road and then entered a wide meadow that rises to the top of a chalk down, whose summit floats 250 feet above sea level. Charcoal trees, a taste of pewter in the mouth. At the down's top, under the moon, near the outline of a Bronze Age burial barrow, I sat in the snow and drank whiskey again. I looked back along the line of my own tracks leading up to the hilltop, away to the northwest where dozens of other print trails spreading far and then further downhill. I picked a trail and set out along it, following those tracks to see where they might lead. It was a ritual walk across the Cairngorm Massif from south to north, and these were the things we met within its course. Grey glacial erratics, silver sand, siskins, pine cones, midges, white pebbles, the skeleton of a raven, footpaths, drove paths, deer paths, dead trees, sadness, rounded mountains, and fire. And these were the many rock types over which we passed in its course: limestone, diorite, quartzite, granulite, granite, slate, firelite, and mica schist. The fire came in the late day gloom on the summit of the pass itself, an episode of combustion in the gathering dark, and the fire, like the walk, was made in memory of my grandfather, who had died on the far side of the mountains, and to whose funeral I was walking as commemoration and as recollection, following the old ways up across a watershed, over the great pass of the Lerrig Grew, and then down through the pine forest on the northern slopes of the massif. Wherever my grandfather had gone in his remarkable life, he had walked. He had been a diplomat and a mountaineer who spent 50 years travelling the world, and in every posting he had sought out high ground, open space and paths. In Bulgaria in 1940, only a few weeks before the country joined the Axis and banished its British diplomats, he was busy exploring the Rilla Mountains. In 1943, he and a climber friend called Robin Hodgkin reached the summit of Demir Kazik, 12,323 feet in the Turkish Aladag. They thought themselves the first summiteers, then found a tattered swastika flag left there by Austrian party several years earlier. Ever alert to propaganda opportunities, my grandfather carried it down to prove to local villagers that the Nazis had plans to annex their mountain. The posting he longed for, but never got, was to Tehran. The politics of Iran fascinated him, but its mountains, rearing snowbound over the city, fascinated him even more. Politics and wild landscape were the two strands of his unusual life. Now he had died, only a few months after my grandmother, in a house at the foot of a mountain range where they had both come to know better than anywhere else. And having walked from north to south across the Isles of Lewis and Harris, I was now setting out to walk from south to north across the inland island of the Cairngorm Massif. I started my crossing of the Cairngorms at Blair Atoll, an hour after dawn. Still air, hot and yellow, tepid with moisture, dark rain clouds to our north. David was with me again, and we walked together up the valley of Glen Tilt, which runs almost exactly due northeast, cutting up into the lower southern hills of the Cairngorms. The first miles were wooded, the river Tilt incised down into the rock, the path keeping well up the valley side. Siskins flashed yellow between the green. Small birds cheeped busily in the canopies. There was just enough wind to stir the loose skin on the pine trunks. Midges clouded the air, encouraging us onwards. The river was glimpsed through evergreens and birch. I saw a dipper in his pianist's white bib, hunting where water poured onto other water, heard the crashing of rapids into plunge pots. There were wide, still pools where the water ran so deep that only the spin and glide of pine needles proved the current's movement. The sound of an engine behind us, then the honk of a horn. An estate Land Rover bounced past, hardly slowing to let us leave the track. The back of the vehicle was open but caged. Two glum-faced young men in flat caps gazed out at us without changing their expressions as they trundled on up the valley. Apprentice ghillies, I guessed, but they looked like inmates being transported between penitentiaries. A mile further on, we passed the estate shooting lodge. 4 men, presumably clients, stood talking 100 yards away under a larch. I raised a hand and called a brief greeting. They paused their conversation, looked blankly at us, resumed talking. It felt as if we had stumbled on an episode of The Prisoner, and I was glad to get away from the estate roads and onto the unmetalled footpaths and former drove paths of the upper tilt. We stopped to rest by a long river pool along the dotted ruins of former shielings. A big salmon leapt from the water and flopped back with a splash like a dropped log. Another dipper whirred upstream from rock to rock, then dived, and I watched its dark form digging along underwater. David stripped and bathed in the pool, letting the river rinse away the morning miles. He swam out to the flat boulder that lay just beneath the water and assumed the lotus position upon it, perched miraculously on the water's surface like a yogi, grinning. But soon the midges moved us on. They were there in their thousands and rose like smoke from the heather as we passed, a robust encouragement to all-day walking. So it was on again, the valley curling round to the north, over a rickety bridge past the vast pools of turf, where a small plaque was raised in memory of a boy who had drowned there a century before. On north-northeast, and then, after 3 further miles, suddenly we were in the open ground of a high flat pass, the first of the day's 2 great watersheds. It was a wide valley of yellow moorgrass through which wandered a footpath, following the route of the old drove road. Seen at a distance, the colour of the mountains was generalised and subdued, the purples and greys of the heather, the bleached grass. But locally at our feet, the moor was a carpet of colour. The gold of tormentil, the greens and pinks of sphagnum, bright stars of the butterwort and sundew, the sage of bog myrtle. East of Beacon Hill, I reached a sustained ridge of chalk. From the woods came the game show buzzers of jays and crows. White beams marked the path to right to left, with their grey-green upper leaves and their sharp silver unders. I walked through a field of common orchids and pink clover, and ate the clover anthers for their nectar. I passed tombs and memorials of different eras, Bronze Age burial mounds which had once held cremated ashes in pottery vessels. Near the lithic Long Barrows, a wayside shrine to a German airman killed in 1940, which was covered with remembrance crosses, rose petals and flints. Then I emerged out of a dark and yew-rich wood and onto a down that stretched for 2 miles or more ahead of me. Bleached light, shining grey beech trunks, a tractor ploughing a distant field to corduroy. Grass flickering in the wind, grasshoppers scraping and bowing. White flints scattered across the fields, tumbleweeds of sheep's wool bowling between them. At dusk I followed a hollowed path that wound up the wooded scarp slope of the downs east of Storrington. The path's depth spoke of continual foot passage over centuries, and I liked its design. It moved in round, cornered zigzags, an uphill meander through the trees. There in the forest, night was further advanced. I turned a corner and a badger bustled out of a bank of dog's mercury, stopped, stared at me, its eyes giving a quick green jewel flash in the dark before it barreled on downhill along its path. And I followed mine uphill, out of the woods and onto the summit plateau of the downs to a place called Chanctonbury Ring, where Lee had slept and where I now wish I hadn't slept the night. The ring is a circle of beech trees planted on a hilltop that had been the site of Bronze and Iron Age fortifications and a Roman temple. In 1760, a young aristocrat from the Scarpfoot village of Whiston, named Charles Goring, decided to add his own layer of history to the Chanctonbury earthworks. He planted beech saplings in a well-spaced circle and, according to one story, then daily carried bottles of water up the slope to irrigate his saplings on that arid downward summit. According to the other story, he got his servants to do the job for him. Either way, the saplings took and flourished and eventually grew into a cathedral grove. For 2 centuries, Chanctonbury was the best-known landmark of the South Downs. On one July evening in 1932, 16,000 people boarded specially scheduled Southern Railway trains in London to follow a moonlit walk over a stretch of the Downs, gathering to watch sunrise from the Ring. But then in 1987, the Great Storm blew in and wrecked Chanctonbury. It's now missing among most of its main trees, and its interior has reverted to a sprouty scrub of ash and bramble. Nevertheless, up there that evening it still felt surprisingly remote. Brighton glittered away to the south, like something far-fetched on fire. The weald to the north was almost lightless. The sky was a tarnishing silver. I rolled my sleeping mat out between 2 of the remaining beech trees just as dark fell and took my shoes and socks off. The rabbit croft turf soothed my feet and I wriggled my toes in it. Then walked the circumference of the Ring. Nearly back at my starting point, I stepped on some sheep dung and had to spend a few minutes flossing the consequences out between my toes with bunches of grass. After I'd eaten, I lay down to sleep, placed an ear to the turf and imagined the depths of history the soil held. Neolithic, Iron Age, Bronze Age, Roman, Augustan, down through all of which the beech roots quested. I held that giddying thought for at least half a minute, and then sank into senseless sleep. I heard the first scream at around 2 o'clock in the morning, a high-pitched and human cry, protracted but falling away in its closing phase. It came from the opposite side of the tree ring to where I was sleeping. My thoughts were sleep-muddled, a child in distress, a rabbit being taken by a weasel or fox. Impossible, though. The sound was coming from at least tree-top height. A bird, then. An owl, surely. But this was like no owl I had ever heard before, not the furry hoot or of a tawny or the screech of a barn owl. I felt a faint rasp of fear dismissed it as ridiculous. Then another cry joined the first, different in tone, slightly deeper and more grainy, rising at its end. The shriek of a blade laid hard to a lathe. Also more human than avian, also unrecognisable to me, also coming from treetop height. I lay there for 2 or 3 minutes listening to the screams. Then I realised, with a prickling in my shoulders and fingers, that the voices had split, and they were now coming towards me. Still at treetop height, but circling round the tree ring, one clockwise and one anti-clockwise, converging roughly on where I was lying. I felt like standing up, shouting, flashing a torch, but instead I lay still and hoped it would all end. The cries met each other almost directly above me, 20 or 30 feet up in the dark. After 15 minutes they stopped, and eventually, uneasily, I fell back to sleep. It was only once I'd got home that I researched the folklore of Chanctonbury Ring. I now know it to be one of the most haunted places of the Downs. Sussex folklore, mostly of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, is rife with examples of it as a portal to the other world. Arthur Beckett, in his 1909 The Spirit of the Downs, had reported that if on a moonless night you walk 7 times round Chanctonbury Ring without stopping, the devil will come out of the wood and hand you a basin of soup in payment for your soul, which sounds like a poor exchange. More energetic variants of the summoning story stipulated that practitioners should circumambulate the ring 17 times on a full moon night while naked, or run backwards 7 times around the ring at midnight on Midsummer Eve. The ghosts that had been summoned in this manner, apart from the devil, included a druid, a lady on a white horse, a white-bearded treasure-seeker, a girl-child, and Julius Caesar and his army. It clearly got crowded up there on busy nights. I also discovered that many people who had tried to sleep out at Chanctonbury had been forced to abandon the hilltop due to an invisible presence or presences. In 1930s, Dr. Philip Goss of Steyning declared in his book Go to the Country that even on bright summer days there is an uncanny sense of some unseen present which seems to follow you about. If you enter the dark wood, you are conscious of something behind you. When you stop, it stops. When you go on, it follows. Most worryingly close to my own experience was a testimony from 1966, when a group of bikers had spent the night at the ring. Things were quiet until after midnight, when a crackling sound started, following by the wailing voice of a woman that appeared to move around the circumference of the ring. The motorcyclists fled and subsequently complained of physical ailments, headaches and lassitude in the limbs. Reading that, I first felt a shock of recognition, and then a mild pride that I'd tolerated what had put a gang of hairy bikers to flight. I woke to a kingfisher dawn, orange cumulus in the east and blue streaks in the cirrus cover overhead. I felt headachy and bone sore and walked along the ring looking for an explanation of the night's screams. None. A white chalk path spooled away east-southeast over high downs, so I followed it along Bramber Bank, a sloping shoulder of turf which dips gracefully into the upper valley of the River Adur. For half a mile of the bank, the path was littered with thousands of striped snail shells, Helix nemoralis, over which I crunched. In one field, ragwort seethed with cinnabar moth caterpillars, Another field was pink with bursts of mallow thrust up from the turf like magicians' sprays of false flowers. Track to track swooped and arced between them. The sun was already hot by the time I reached the medieval church of the Botolphs, where my friend Rob Mengham, a Downsman by birth and upbringing, and a poet, archaeologist and writer by practice, was waiting in the shade of the tower to walk a few miles with me. I was very happy to see him. East of the River Adur, the Downs run in 3 long plateaux separated by stream and river valleys. On the high point of the first, Edburton Hill, are the earthworks of a Mott and Bailey castle, which in spring and early summer are knee-high in wildflower meadow. Rod and I stopped there and lounged among the flowers in a dry westerly wind, talking about Thomas, Revilius, and why I should never have slept in Chanctonbury Ring. A buzzard searched for thermals above the scarp slope, moving over the ground in a swift flapping flight, until suddenly it found an updraft, and one wingtip was buffeted, and the bird adjusted and tacked in response. And then its whole body changed posture, its tails and its primaries spreading and its wings bracing until it was able to ride the heat in an upwards helter-skelter, its wings curved to catch the rising air. I recognised only a few of the dozen of plant species that made up the meadow in which we were sitting, though Rod could identify more of them. Agrimony, wild mignonette, red clover, yellow rattle, marjoram, scabious, knapweed, lady's bedstraw, hawthorn shoot, and the odd tall bolt of fireweed. Through them all wandered the string-like stem of bindweed. I'd been trying to learn more of the common English wildflowers using a 19th century handbook called Flowers of the Field by the Reverend C. A. Johns, a hugely popular Victorian field guide which Thomas had owned and used. Johns helped Thomas become a fine amateur botanist and a self-taught specialist in the fairy flora of the chalk. Thomas's children had in turn learned the chalk plants so well that when Eleanor Fargin first visited the family at their home in Steep, the children picked 100 different species and set her a naming test. Lying there in the meadow, idle and drowsy from the sun, the walk and the druggist scent of the flowers, with the flies weaving a gauzy mesh of sound above me, I thought that if I fell asleep, the bindweed tendrils might lace and sidle around my limbs, and I would wake like Gulliver and Lilliput, bound forever to the ground. woke again the next morning by exulting skylarks. I knew now from skylark experience that sleep was no longer possible. So before dawn I walked down into Lewes and then onto the southern slopes of Mount Carbon, the only major summit of the Downs that outlies the main chain. Purple heads of marjoram thrummed in the warming breeze. I picked up a scabious head and pinches of wild thyme. Near Glynde I crossed the Ouse, the river, mucky-banked, beginning to loop as it neared its floodplain in the sea. The path climbed again, up onto Firle Down. Teasels were flowering purply blue, their seed slots arranged in dense helical pattern upon the seed head. On one of the teasel heads, a bee was buried face down in the blue, its legs spread wide in nectar ecstasy as if floating in water. Late in the day, tired in the legs, I reached Cradle Hill, into whose eastern slope a great white chalk horse had been cut. Below me, the river Cuckmere made its greasy meanders towards the sea. I dropped off the scarp down to the river and then along the edge of the Cuckmere for 2 or 3 miles. The brown river mud was a rich text of bird prints, and my boot marks joined the tracks of heron, cormorant, gull, and egret, more densely printed even than the snow I'd walked at night in the winter. The river water was the colour of milk chocolate. I found and kept an egret wing feather, washing powder white, and I picked a trail of bryony, its leaves shaped like glossy baroque hearts. Near Exiat, a cormorant ducked under the water, its dark shape darting and surging, then popped up with an eel in its beak. The eel flashed and whipped, stiff as a bike chain, gave the cormorant the slip and spun free. An hour before dusk, I stood on the summit of a small chalk bluff from which I looked down onto Cuckmere Haven, the point at which the river reaches the channel. It is a wide bay of flint shingle with a shallowingly sloping foreshore, formerly guarded by slumping pillboxes. Coastguard cottages perch on the high ground to its west, and to its east the white cliffs of the Seven Sisters are strung out like a line of washed and pegged sheets. Fledging little owls made test flights between the branches of sycamores. A pale horse stood motionless in a cropped field, gazing northwards. The tide was high, and for 100 feet away from the shore, the water was the colour of greeny milk. The waves had sluiced chalk from the foreshore and cliffs, and the sea was holding the particles in a glaucous and letterless suspension. I walked down onto the shore and along the tide line, which was cobbled with flint boulders. Beneath the first of the sisters, my eye was caught by a clutch of grey flints which lay together like eggs, right at the foot of the cliff. I picked them up one by one, amazed. Each one had a drawing of a creature on it, made in chalk. The style was Lascaux, naive but fluent in line. A deer, a gull, a hawk, a seal, a human figure. Somebody must have been sitting here that afternoon, using a piece of chalk from the cliffs to draw those figures onto the flints. I placed the largest of the stones on a flat outcrop of chalk, and then arranged the others above them in decreasing size order. Hawk on top of seal, on top of deer, on top of human. A simple cairn at the river mouth, marking my seafall and the end of the walk. I looked out over the channel, over the dissolving margin of chalk in the waves, the white ribbon of the path, the snow white of the flints, the blinding white of the egrets. Pasture by Mary Oliver. On the first day of snow, when the white curtain of winter began to stream down, the house where I lived grew distant, and at first it seemed imperative to hurry home. But later, not much later, I began to see that soft, snowbound house as I would always remember it, and I would linger a long time in the pasture, turning in circles, staring at all the crisp, exciting, snow-filled roads that led away. Hello everyone. So I hope you enjoyed this video. I realised it was very long and it had lots of different elements to it. It's a composition of slow stitch, different projects, different pages in my slow stitch, one of my slow stitch books. Also music and some readings. The readings are from a book called The Old Ways, A Journey on Foot by Robert Macfarlane. I'll put the title, etc., down in the description box. And the reading of the poetry by Mary Oliver is from the book Red Bird and Poems by Mary Oliver. So again, I'll put the title down below. I hope you enjoyed those readings. I hope you enjoyed the slow stitch element as well, which was the main element, but I haven't been on for a little while because, I haven't been too good. My voice hasn't been great. I'm just getting back now. As you can probably hear, it's a little bit husky. But anyway, and I hope you enjoyed the music. I know that it's not everybody's cup of tea, and I hope it didn't detract too much from the video. I recommend turning it down, putting it on mute or whatever if you don't enjoy it. But I hope you enjoyed the slow stitch and found some inspiration amongst the pages. And I look forward to coming back and doing some more work very soon. Hopefully another video quite soon. And I just wish everybody well, and I look forward to being back. So take care everybody, and I'll be back very soon. Bye for now.